But nobody can deny that this story is moving on in leaps and bounds, isn't it?
It is. And of course, since you and I started to discuss it, I think the last time we discussed it just a few days ago, it's changed markedly. And I think Harold Wilson, you're probably too young to remember Harold Wilson,
Would
but
I were. I'm not.
he once said a week is a long time in politics.
Yes.
Well, it seems to be eons of time in BBC politics.
I mean, the revelation that the BBC itself was investigating Huw Edwards' behaviour, and it was the Newsnight team, I think piloted by Victoria Derbyshire, who were looking into it, and that this predates The Sun and anything that the newspaper had to report or reveal is quite something, isn't it? Particularly as it seemed to take so long for the BBC to respond to the complaint by the parents of the young person who they said was being targeted by Huw Edwards.
Well, without wishing to be flattering to you, as always, you put your finger right on it. This is ludicrous, isn't it? You've got the BBC management who sit on this information for weeks. 2 floors below where the Director General sits, there's a team, it would appear from Newsnight, working on similar allegations suggesting that Huw had lost a grip of how he should conduct himself, particularly with what are deemed to be vulnerable younger members of staff. And I think that the BBC comes out of this so badly. They hoped it was going to go away and they wouldn't have to take on Huw Edwards. But of course, they had people sitting 2 floors below who seemed determined that it wouldn't go away. And I'm just amazed that, even someone of the eminence of Victoria Derbyshire can just get on and do things without feeling the need to, or having an obligation to clear her lines with more senior people in management. It's farcical, actually. And what a way to run a railroad. And in particular, what a way to run a publicly funded public service broadcaster. Because, if there's one thing we know about the BBC, because they're paid for by us all through our license fees, there's plenty of them around. It was always a great joke about the BBC, wasn't it? Whenever there was a crisis, assistant heads must roll, it was said. Well, you think to yourself, what on earth were they doing? I mean, whatever Huw Edwards has or has not done, which I personally have no particular interest in probing further, one thing is clear: what the BBC are doing is way, way, way below the standards to be expected of an overmanaged organisation like them.
I mean, one of the things that we've found out so far is that Tim Davie, the Director General of the BBC, did not phone his highest paid newsreader and say to him when the complaint was brought to his attention, or didn't know that Newsnight were investigating his highest paid newsreader, so couldn't react to it. But when he did know, he didn't ring Huw Edwards or Mrs. Edwards or Huw Edwards' agent or anybody at all and say, could Huw please be brought to my office so that we can have a chat about this? Now, various employment lawyers have said pretty sanctimoniously on this programme to me, well, it wouldn't have been right, it might have impeded protocol or due process or something of that ilk. But Jo Mackey, the eminent employment lawyer, was on the show just earlier, and she said, of course he should have done that. Not only could he have done it, he should have done it. It would have been the right thing in terms of duty of care to speak to the person concerned and say, now, look, Huw, this is what people are saying. Is there any substance to it? And then she said he should have been suspended on full pay pending an investigation. But speaking to him and trying to find out as the commander of this enormously unwieldy ship should have been the first thing to do.
Yes, and I'm sure nothing like as eminent a lawyer as whoever that chap was, who I'd never actually heard of, but then that's my fault, not yours. That basically, I mean, why didn't they just go about it directly? The idea that they're so frightened of the law, maybe after the Cliff Richard case and all their other little scandals, perhaps they have a right to be. But what was quite clear is that Huw Edwards should have been asked what was going on. And an informal chat with a man who pays him $450,000 a year might seem to be top of any normal person's agenda. But, to be honest, it may be in order to get to the top of the BBC, you haven't got to be normal.
And of course, we now have this sad scenario, don't we, where you know, Huw Edwards seems to be in a very bad way indeed, and we've been told by his wife he's going to be in hospital for the foreseeable future. His mental health is in shreds and tatters. Then we have all these other people, the young people that he's meant to have contacted in various different ways, or seen during lockdown, or asked for photographs of, or whatever it is, all the different things he's done. Not to mention BBC colleagues who seem to be very upset by the way in which he's treated them. So there's an awful lot of mental health to take into consideration at this point.
Well, exactly. But there's, you know, what we have with the BBC is masses of overmanagement leading to total undermanagement. And I think that the BBC, I think, is living in a fool's paradise, because when I was Minister for Broadcasting, as I attempted to be for almost 10 years in the 80s and early 90s, on and off, it was always regarded as axiomatic that there would be a license fee. The only issue was how much it was going to be. Well, I'm not sure that's any longer the case. And this level of startling ineptitude, where the BBC, which is supposed to set an example to us all, has fumbled around with a case that, as you rightly say, a proper manager would have just got to the bottom of it in 2 or 3 conversations over a Friday afternoon. You have to say to yourself, if the BBC is trying to make a case that we cannot do without them, and therefore we have to regard the license fee as an utterly proper poll tax, as it actually is, a poll tax on all of us, I don't think they're making a very good fist of it, do you?
Well, quite interestingly, I suppose you could say that the part of the BBC that lots of people might feel that they couldn't do without was really the bit piloted by Huw Edwards, because, you know, his, you know, excellent, judicious, even-handed and you know, fluent and you know, sympathetic coverage, for example, of Her Late Majesty's funeral, of the coronation, really has been beyond reproach. He is a professional, and people do like and warm to him and his presenting style, and he does a damn good job, I think you'll probably agree. And he really is, ironically, probably the face, voice and presence of the BBC that most people do consider to be worth the licence fee.
I agree. I mean, Huw Edwards has never been a big part of my life. We wouldn't, I think, because I was close friends, but I have known Huw because his wife, who I think has emerged wonderfully well from this, and I feel so sorry for her.
Yes,
her parents, now both dead, were great friends of mine and were very active in Wandsworth, where I had my parliamentary constituency. So I have really known Vicky and I've known Huw for several decades. And what I don't understand is exactly, I think, the point that you're making. Shouldn't either he have looked for help, or shouldn't people who were close to him have known that something wasn't right and got to the bottom of it, rather than, you know, talking about the weather, which is what they seem to have done?
I suppose, you know, David, it is very awkward. You know, you may suspect, but you don't want to overstep the mark. This is Great Britain, at any rate, where people are quite reserved about their private life. You know, you wouldn't want to tread on somebody's toes. You wouldn't want to suggest something's awry if somebody's implying that things are okay. You know what it's like. It's awkward. Awkward in a professional capacity, and awkward in a friendly capacity to start asking people about their private lives, isn't it?
You know, I mean, you and I would have loved, I think, to have more privilege in our private life than we've ever been allowed. But the point is,
true.
I would have expected someone to have mentioned it to him, because after all, what was gained by this whole thing being allowed to lurch on? Nothing. Huw Edwards' career, I think, you know, sad to say, is over. I think that if someone had been able to point out to him earlier on, he might at least have been able to avoid some of the things that he is said to have done, and some of the more embarrassing things. But also, I think that the BBC cannot have a situation where it cannot run its own affairs properly. And the idea that, you know, come back to a point I made earlier, but maybe bears repeating, the Director General sits up there ignoring this, and 2 floors below, a team that he allegedly employs and is responsible for, led by, it would appear, by Victoria Derbyshire, are working on an expose of Huw Edwards, and he knows nothing about it. Come on, you know? Well, come on,
It is
this isn't the way
absolutely.
it'd be working.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? It really is. That's why this story is running and running, because nobody can believe any of the permutations, ramifications, or any of the basic tenets of the story. It's absolutely bizarre. Thank you so much for joining us, David. Hugely appreciated.